quiet voice inside your head has been lying to you. That persistent whisper telling you, "This is just who I am." It's the most dangerous falsehood you've ever believed. And today, right here in this room, we're going to shatter that illusion forever. You see, there's a revolution happening right now in our understanding of human potential. Not in some distant laboratory or hidden behind academic walls, but right here in the 3 pounds of remarkable tissue sitting between your ears. Your brain, that mysterious universe of 86 billion neurons, holds a truth so profound it will transform everything you believe about who you are and what you're capable of becoming. Let me share something with you that changed my entire perspective on human potential. In a remote village, there lived a man who had never learned to read. For 40 years, he accepted this as his unchangeable reality. "This is just who I am," he would say, echoing that same quiet voice that may be whispering to you right now. But one day something extraordinary happened. His granddaughter was born, and as she grew, she began bringing home books from school. This man, who had spent 4 decades believing his brain was simply not built for reading, made a decision that would prove everything he believed about himself was wrong. He began to learn. At first it was just letters, painful and slow. His weathered hands, more accustomed to hard labor than holding books, would shake as he traced each symbol. The other villagers laughed. "You can't teach an old dog new tricks," they said. But something remarkable was happening inside his brain, something that defies everything we once believed about human limitations. Month by month, his brain began to rewire itself. New neural pathways formed, strengthened, and multiplied. This man, who had never read a single word for 40 years, gradually transformed into someone who could not only read, but eventually became the village's most passionate advocate for adult education. He didn't just learn to read, he reinvented himself entirely. This isn't just a heartwarming story about perseverance. It's a powerful demonstration of what neuroscientists now know to be true. Your brain is not fixed. It's not a static organ that reaches its peak in youth and then begins a slow decline. It's a dynamic, ever-changing network that continues to grow, adapt, and rewire itself throughout your entire life. But here's the part that should shake you to your core. This incredible capacity for change, this ability to literally rewire your brain, isn't something reserved for extraordinary circumstances or exceptional individuals. It's happening right now in your brain as you listen to these words. Every thought you think, every belief you hold, every habit you maintain is physically reshaping your neural pathways. Every time you tell yourself, "I'm not good enough, I'm too old, I'm not talented enough," you're not just having a thought. You're physically reinforcing neural pathways that make those limiting beliefs stronger. You're literally rewiring your brain to believe in your own limitations. But here's where it gets truly exciting. Just as you can rewire your brain to believe in limitations, you can rewire it for greatness. This isn't positive thinking or wishful fantasy. It's hard science wrapped in the miracle of human potential. Consider this. In a groundbreaking study, researchers worked with a group of people who had never played piano. They divided them into 2 groups. The first group practiced a simple melody on a piano for 2 hours a day. The second group sat in front of a piano for the same amount of time but only imagined playing the melody. Their fingers never touched the keys. After 5 days, something astonishing happened. The group that physically practiced showed expected improvement in their playing ability. But here's what's remarkable. The group that only imagined playing also showed significant improvement. When researchers examined their brains, they found that both groups had developed similar neural pathways. The mere act of imagining themselves playing the piano had created physical changes in their brains almost identical to those who actually played. What does this tell us? Your brain doesn't always distinguish between what you vividly imagine and what you physically experience. Every time you envision yourself succeeding, overcoming challenges, or developing new abilities, you're creating neural pathways that support those outcomes. But let me be clear. This isn't about sitting in a room imagining success and expecting it to manifest. This is about understanding that your brain is constantly rewiring itself based on your thoughts, beliefs, and actions. And once you truly understand this, you'll realize that you have far more control over your destiny than you ever imagined. A skill you've always wanted to master, a goal you've dreamed of achieving, or a person you've wished to become. Now understand this. The only thing standing between you and that reality is the current wiring of your brain. and that wiring is not fixed. It's not your destiny. It's not your limitation. It's simply your current state. And current states can be changed. But here's where most people get it wrong. They wait for motivation to strike before taking action. They wait to feel ready before making a change. They wait for circumstances to be perfect before pursuing their dreams. But this is fundamentally misunderstanding how the brain works. Your brain doesn't rewire itself through intention. It rewires itself through action. Every single action you take, no matter how small, creates new neural pathways. Every time you push past your comfort zone, face a fear, or try something new, you're physically restructuring your brain to become more capable, more resilient, and more aligned with your true potential. Let me share another powerful example that illustrates this principle. There was a study conducted with two groups of workers in a factory. Both groups were given the same task, assembling small mechanical parts. The first group was told to focus on speed and efficiency. The second group was told something different. They were told their work was part of creating life-saving medical equipment. Both groups performed the exact same tasks, but the results were strikingly different. The second group, who understood the meaningful impact of their work, not only showed higher productivity, but also demonstrated greater problem-solving abilities, better collaboration, and significantly higher job satisfaction. Their brains had literally rewired themselves to approach the same task differently, simply because they understood its greater purpose. This reveals another crucial aspect of rewiring your brain for greatness: the power of meaning. When you attach profound meaning to your actions, when you understand the deeper purpose behind what you're doing, your brain creates stronger, more resilient neural pathways. It's not just about changing what you do. It's about transforming why you do it. The habits you currently have that aren't serving your highest potential. Perhaps it's procrastination, self-doubt, or the tendency to give up when things get difficult. These aren't character flaws or unchangeable traits. They're simply well-worn neural pathways that your brain has learned to follow. But just as a river can carve new paths through solid rock, your brain can create new pathways that lead to different outcomes. But let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. What if the life you're currently living isn't the result of your capabilities, but rather the result of the stories you've been telling yourself? What if your current reality is simply a reflection of the neural pathways you've strengthened over time, rather than your true potential? These aren't comfortable questions to consider. They force us to confront the possibility that we've been the architects of our own limitations. But within this uncomfortable truth lies incredible power. Because if we've been the architects of our limitations, we can also be the architects of our transformation. Consider how many times you've talked yourself out of taking a risk, pursuing an opportunity, or making a change. Each time you did that, you strengthened the neural pathways associated with fear, doubt, and limitation. But imagine what would happen if you started strengthening different pathways. Imagine if you began reinforcing circuits of courage, capability, and unlimited potential. This is where the real work begins. This is where we move beyond understanding and into action. Because knowledge without action is like having a map but never taking the journey. Your brain doesn't rewire itself through understanding alone. It rewires itself through consistent, purposeful action. In the next segment of our journey together, we're going to explore specific strategies for rewiring your brain for greatness. We'll discover how to break free from limiting patterns, create new neural pathways aligned with your highest potential, and transform your life from the inside out. But before we do that, I want you to sit with this question. If you truly believed that you could rewire your brain to achieve anything you deeply desired, what would you choose to become? Let that question sink in for a moment. Feel its weight. Feel its possibility. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just information. It's a blueprint for transformation. You see, most people live their entire lives never understanding a fundamental truth about the human brain. It operates primarily through patterns. Every thought, every emotion, every action you take is essentially your brain following established neural pathways. These pathways are like trails in a forest. The more they're traveled, the more defined they become. But here's what's truly fascinating. Your brain doesn't judge these patterns. It doesn't distinguish between patterns that serve you and patterns that limit you. It simply follows the paths of least resistance, the trails that have been walked most frequently. Let me share a story that illustrates this principle perfectly. There was a young boy who grew up in a small apartment above his family's modest grocery store. Every day, he would watch his father meticulously count the day's earnings, always ending with the same sigh and the same words, "Just enough to get by." Day after day, year after year, this pattern repeated itself. This boy grew up believing that life was about just getting by. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was a pattern etched into his neural pathways through years of observation and repetition. Even when he started his own business years later, despite having tremendous potential for growth, he found himself unconsciously making decisions that kept his business just getting by. Then one day, he discovered something that changed everything. He learned about a simple principle that master crafters use: measure twice, cut once. But he didn't just apply this to woodworking or construction. He applied it to his thinking patterns. He began to catch himself every time he was about to make a decision based on the just getting by mentality. Each time he caught himself, he would stop and ask two questions. What would this decision look like if I were aiming for extraordinary success instead of just getting by? And what belief system am I operating from right now? These questions became his measure twice moment. Within 3 years, his business had grown tenfold, but more importantly, his entire worldview had transformed. He hadn't just changed his actions, he had literally rewired his brain's operating patterns. This brings us to the first key principle of rewiring your brain for greatness: pattern interruption. Your brain's existing patterns are like deep grooves in a record, playing the same song over and over. To change the music, you must first interrupt the pattern. The pattern's running your life right now. How do you respond to challenges? What's your immediate reaction to opportunities? What's your default thinking when faced with the unknown? These responses aren't random, they're patterns, and patterns can be changed. But here's where most people go wrong. They try to change their patterns through willpower alone. They try to force new behaviors without understanding that sustainable change requires a complete rewiring of the brain's circuitry. Consider this remarkable study. A group of subjects were asked to perform a simple task: pressing a button when they saw a specific symbol on a screen. Unknown to them, before each symbol appeared, a smaller symbol flashed so quickly that it couldn't be consciously perceived. Over time, their brains began to recognize this subliminal pattern, and their reaction times improved significantly, even though they were never consciously aware of the pattern. What does this tell us? Your brain is constantly creating patterns, even without your conscious awareness. But here's the empowering part. Once you become aware of these patterns, you can consciously choose to create new ones. This brings us to the second key principle: conscious pattern creation. This is where the real magic happens. Instead of letting your brain create patterns randomly based on circumstances and past experiences, you begin deliberately creating patterns that serve your highest potential. But how do you create new patterns in your brain? It starts with understanding 3 fundamental elements: focus, repetition, and emotional intensity. Focus determines what your brain pays attention to. Whatever you consistently focus on, your brain assumes is important and begins creating neural pathways to support it. This is why people who constantly focus on problems tend to find more problems, while those who focus on opportunities tend to find more opportunities. Repetition strengthens these neural pathways. Think of it like walking through that forest again. Each time you walk the same path, it becomes more defined, more established. This is why habits, both good and bad, become stronger over time. But here's the element most people miss: emotional intensity. Your brain creates stronger neural pathways when experiences are charged with emotion. This is why you can remember exactly where you were during moments of intense joy or profound sadness, but might struggle to remember what you had for lunch last Tuesday. Let me share another powerful example that brings these elements together. There was a swimming coach who worked with young athletes. He noticed that many of his students would hit a plateau in their performance and couldn't seem to break through, despite having the physical capability to do so. One day, he tried something different. Instead of focusing on technique or physical training, he had his swimmers spend time each day visualizing their perfect race. But he didn't just have them see it, he had them feel it. He asked them to experience the cool water against their skin, feel their muscles powering through each stroke, hear the muted sounds underwater, taste the chlorine in their mouths, and most importantly, feel the emotion of achieving their perfect time. The results were extraordinary. Within weeks, swimmers who had been stuck at the same times for months began breaking their personal records. Their brains had created new neural pathways associated with success, and their bodies followed suit. This leads us to the third key principle of rewiring your brain: emotional integration. It's not enough to simply think about what you want to achieve or who you want to become. You must feel it at an emotional level. When you combine focus, repetition, and emotional intensity, you create what I call a neural trifecta, a perfect storm for brain rewiring. This is where transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you deliberately used these three elements to create new patterns in your brain? When was the last time you consciously chose what neural pathways you wanted to strengthen? Most people leave their brains rewiring to chance. They let their patterns be shaped by circumstances, by other people's expectations, by their fears and limiting beliefs. They're like a master sculptor who never picks up their chisel, letting the elements randomly shape their masterpiece. You're sitting here right now because something inside you knows there's more. Something inside you recognizes that the patterns currently running your life aren't the patterns that will lead you to greatness. That recognition, that awareness, is the first crack in the old programming. In the next segment, we're going to dive even deeper. We're going to explore specific techniques for interrupting limiting patterns and creating new ones aligned with your highest potential. We're going to learn how to use the neural trifecta to literally reshape your brain's circuitry. But before we do that, I want you to take a moment. Think about the patterns that have been running your life. Are they patterns you consciously chose? Or are they patterns you inherited? Patterns you accidentally fell into? Patterns that were created by circumstances rather than choice? Because here's the truth. Every pattern in your brain right now was created through focus, repetition, and emotional intensity. The only question is, were you the conscious creator of these patterns, or were you simply their unconscious host? The power to reshape your brain's wiring patterns is one of the most profound gifts you possess. Yet most people will go to their graves never having fully embraced this power. They'll live their entire lives running on patterns they didn't choose, achieving results they don't want, and wondering why change seems so impossible. But you're not most people. You're here because something within you has awakened to a greater possibility. And now that you understand the principles behind brain rewiring, it's time to master the practice of it. Let me share something remarkable with you. In the heart of a bustling city, there was a choir director who worked with people who believed they couldn't sing. Not people who actually couldn't sing. People who believed they couldn't sing. There's a crucial difference. These people had carried this belief for decades. Some had been told in childhood that they were tone deaf. Others had been laughed at when they tried to sing. Each of them had created deep neural pathways associated with "I can't sing." This choir director had an unusual approach. Instead of starting with singing, she started with listening. She would have her students sit in absolute silence, eyes closed, and listen to a single pure tone for 5 minutes. Then she would ask them to try to match that tone, not with their voice, but in their mind. So only after they could clearly hear the tone in their mind did she ask them to attempt to produce it with their voice. And here's what was fascinating. When they finally did try to sing, most of them could match the tone perfectly. Why? Because they had created new neural pathways associated with hearing and producing musical notes before they ever tried to sing. Within 6 months, these tone-deaf individuals were performing in public. They hadn't just learned to sing. They had rewired their brains to override decades of limiting beliefs about their musical ability. This brings us to the fourth key principle of rewiring your brain: mental rehearsal. Your brain creates new neural pathways not just through physical practice, but through focused mental practice as well. But here's the crucial element that most people miss. Mental rehearsal must be done with absolute clarity and emotional engagement. Vague visualizations create vague results. Detailed, emotionally charged mental rehearsal creates precise neural pathways. Something you believe you can't do right now. Perhaps it's public speaking, or learning a new language, or advancing in your career. That belief isn't a fact. It's simply a well-worn neural pathway. And just like those tone-deaf individuals learn to sing, you can learn to excel at whatever you currently believe is beyond your capabilities. But this brings us to a critical question. How do you begin rewiring decades of established neural patterns? The answer lies in understanding what I call the 3 phases of neural reconstruction. Phase 1 is pattern disruption. This is where you consciously interrupt your existing patterns the moment you notice them. When you catch yourself thinking, "I can't," you stop. When you notice yourself retreating from opportunity, you pause. When you find yourself reinforcing old limitations, you interrupt the pattern. Let me give you a powerful example of pattern disruption in action. There was a man who had been passed over for promotion multiple times. Each time it happened, he would retreat to his office, close the door, and spend hours analyzing what was wrong with him. This pattern had become so ingrained that his colleagues could predict his behavior whenever opportunities for advancement arose. One day, he learned about pattern disruption. The next time he was passed over for promotion, he caught himself just as he was about to retreat to his office. Instead of following his usual pattern, he did something radically different. He walked straight to his supervisor's office and asked for specific feedback about what skills he needed to develop to be considered for future promotions. This single pattern disruption changed everything. Not only did he receive valuable feedback, but his supervisor saw him in a new light, as someone who could handle disappointment professionally and was committed to growth. Within 6 months, he was promoted to a position higher than the one he had originally sought. This leads us to Phase 2, pattern installation. Once you've disrupted an old pattern, you must immediately install a new one. Nature abhors a vacuum, and your brain is no different. If you don't consciously install a new pattern, your brain will default back to the old one. Pattern installation requires 3 elements we discussed earlier: focus, repetition, and emotional intensity. But now we're going to use them with surgical precision. When installing a new pattern, you must first define it with absolute clarity. What exactly do you want your new response to be? How precisely do you want your brain to be wired? This isn't about vague intentions. It's about specific, detailed patterns. For instance, instead of saying, "I want to be more confident," you define exactly what confidence means to you. How does a confident person walk? How do they speak? How do they handle challenges? How do they carry themselves in different situations? The more specific you are, the more precise your brain's rewiring will be. Then comes Phase 3, pattern reinforcement. This is where most attempts at change fail. People disrupt old patterns and install new ones, but they don't reinforce them long enough for them to become the brain's new default setting. Think of it like this: your old patterns are like deep rivers that have been flowing for years. When you create a new pattern, you're essentially digging a new riverbed. If you don't consistently direct water down this new path, the old river will remain the path of least resistance. Pattern reinforcement requires what I call conscious consistency, the deliberate practice of your new patterns until they become automatic. This isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. Every time you practice your new pattern, you're deepening that new riverbed, making it easier for future thoughts and behaviors to flow in that direction. But here's something crucial to understand. The process of rewiring your brain isn't always comfortable. In fact, if you're comfortable during this process, you're probably not pushing hard enough to create real change. Your brain has spent years, perhaps decades, running on its current patterns. When you begin to change these patterns, your brain will resist. It will try to pull you back to familiar territory, back to your comfort zone, back to the patterns it knows. This resistance isn't a sign that something's wrong, it's a sign that something's right. It's evidence that you're pushing beyond your brain's current wiring and creating new neural pathways. Every time you feel that resistance, every time your brain tries to pull you back to old patterns, you're standing at a crucial crossroads. In that moment, you have a choice. You can retreat to familiar territory, or you can push forward and strengthen your new neural pathways. What if you started seeing this resistance as a signal that you're on the right track? What if you began to welcome the discomfort of rewiring as evidence of your transformation in progress? In the next segment, we're going to explore specific techniques for pushing through this resistance. We're going to learn how to use discomfort as a compass pointing toward growth, and how to maintain momentum when everything in your brain is screaming for you to return to familiar patterns. But before we move forward, I want you to consider something. What patterns in your life are due for disruption? What neural pathways have you been strengthening that no longer serve your highest potential? And most importantly, what new patterns are you ready to install in their place? The resistance you feel when creating new neural pathways isn't your enemy. It's your ally. It's a signal that you're pushing beyond your brain's comfort zone, beyond the familiar patterns that have defined your life until now. But pushing through this resistance requires more than just willpower. It requires understanding what I call the architecture of transformation. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates this principle. In a small town, there was a craftsman known for his extraordinary ability to transform raw stones into beautiful sculptures. People would watch him work, mesmerized by how he could see potential in rocks that others would pass by without a second glance. One day, a young apprentice asked him, "How do you know which parts of the stone to chip away?" The craftsman's response holds a profound lesson for anyone seeking to rewire their brain for greatness. He said, "I don't see it as chipping away. I see it as revealing what's already there. The masterpiece exists within the stone. My job is simply to remove everything that isn't part of it." This is exactly how you must approach the rewiring of your brain. The greatness you seek isn't something you need to create from scratch. It's already there, buried beneath layers of limiting patterns, self-doubt, and inherited beliefs. Your job is to chip away everything that isn't part of your true potential. This brings us to the fifth key principle of rewiring your brain: selective demolition. Just as the sculptor must carefully choose which parts of the stone to remove, you must be selective about which neural patterns you choose to dismantle. But here's where most people go wrong. They try to eliminate all their old patterns at once. They declare war on their entire existing neural architecture, attempting to demolish everything and rebuild from scratch. This approach almost always leads to failure, overwhelm, and a return to old patterns. Instead, successful brain rewiring requires what I call strategic pattern selection. You must choose specific patterns to work on, one at a time, while maintaining enough of your existing neural architecture to keep functioning effectively in your daily life. If you were renovating a house, you wouldn't demolish all the walls at once. You'd work on one room at a time, ensuring the rest of the house remains livable during the renovation process. The same principle applies to rewiring your brain. Let me give you a powerful example of strategic pattern selection in action. There was a salesman who had been in his field for 15 years. He was moderately successful, but he had hit a plateau he couldn't seem to break through. When he examined his patterns, he discovered something fascinating. He had a deeply ingrained pattern of ending his sales presentations with a subtle apology. He wasn't explicitly saying, "I'm sorry," but his tone, his body language, and his choice of words all conveyed an apologetic energy for asking for the sale. This pattern had become so automatic that he didn't even realize he was doing it. Instead of trying to overhaul his entire sales approach, he focused solely on this one pattern. He worked on replacing his apologetic closing with what he called his service close, a genuine expression of how his product or service would benefit the client. The results were remarkable. Within 3 months, his sales had increased by 40%. But here's what's truly fascinating. By focusing on changing this one pattern, other patterns began to shift naturally. His confidence grew, his presentations became more powerful, and his entire approach to sales transformed. This is what I call the domino effect of pattern change. When you successfully change one significant pattern, it creates a ripple effect that naturally influences other related patterns. Your brain begins to recognize its own capacity for change, making subsequent pattern shifts easier and more natural. But this brings us to a crucial question. How do you choose which patterns to change first? This is where the sixth principle comes into play. Pattern prioritization. Every pattern in your brain serves a purpose, even the ones that limit you. These patterns were originally created to help you in some way, to protect you, to make your life easier or safer. Before you can effectively change a pattern, you must understand its original purpose and ensure you have a better pattern to serve that purpose. Consider this. A person who procrastinates isn't just being lazy. Their procrastination pattern likely serves multiple purposes. It might help them avoid the pain of potential failure, manage their anxiety, or maintain a sense of control. Simply trying to eliminate procrastination without addressing these underlying needs will likely lead to failure or the creation of equally problematic patterns. This is why successful brain rewiring requires what I call the 3 questions of pattern prioritization. First, what purpose does this pattern serve? Second, what's the cost of maintaining this pattern? Third, what better pattern could serve the same purpose? Let me share another example that brings this principle to life. There was a talented artist who had a pattern of never showing her work in public. On the surface, this might seem like simple fear of rejection, but when she asked herself these 3 questions, she discovered something deeper. The pattern of keeping her art private served multiple purposes. It protected her from criticism, yes, but more importantly, it allowed her to maintain a perfect vision of her potential without having to test it against reality. The cost was clear. Her work remained unseen, her talent unexpressed, her potential unrealized. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of trying to force herself to start showing her work publicly, she first created a new pattern that served the same protective purpose in a healthier way. She developed what she called her growth gallery, a small group of trusted fellow artists who would give her constructive feedback. This new pattern served the same protective purpose as keeping her work private, but in a way that allowed for growth and eventual public sharing. Within a year, she had her first successful gallery showing, and today her work is displayed in collections around the country. This is the power of pattern prioritization. It allows you to change limiting patterns while honoring their original protective purpose. It's not about destroying old patterns, it's about evolving them into something better. But here's something crucial to understand. The process of rewiring your brain isn't just about changing individual patterns. It's about elevating your entire operating system to a new level of functioning. This requires what I call conscious pattern integration. Conscious pattern integration is the art of ensuring that your new patterns work together harmoniously, supporting and reinforcing each other rather than creating internal conflict. It's about creating a coherent neural architecture that supports your highest potential. Each new pattern you create is like adding a new instrument to an orchestra. The instrument might be beautiful on its own, but true magnificence comes when all instruments play in harmony. The same is true of your neural patterns. In the final segment, we're going to explore how to achieve this neural harmony. We'll discover how to ensure your new patterns work together to create a symphony of excellence in your life. But before we do that, I want you to consider this question. What patterns in your life are playing out of tune with your highest potential? And what new patterns could create a more harmonious melody of success? As we stand here at this crucial moment, let's understand something profound. The patterns running your life right now are not your destiny. They're simply your current reality. And just as a master composer can transform a simple melody into a magnificent symphony, you can transform your neural patterns into a masterpiece of human potential. Let me share one final story that brings together everything we've discussed about rewiring your brain for greatness. In a small classical orchestra, there was a violinist who had reached what everyone considered the peak of his abilities. He was good, but not exceptional. After 20 years of playing, his patterns were so deeply ingrained that even his teachers suggested he had reached his ceiling. But this violinist understood something that would transform not just his playing, but our understanding of human potential. He realized that his playing ceiling wasn't caused by a lack of talent or practice. It was caused by the harmonious integration of mediocre patterns. You see, each aspect of his playing, his bow technique, his finger positioning, his posture, his breathing, had found a comfortable harmony. But it was a harmony of limitation, not excellence. Each pattern supported and reinforced the others in maintaining this ceiling of capability. This brings us to our final key principle of brain rewiring: harmonic pattern evolution. The violinist didn't just work on changing individual patterns. He worked on evolving the entire harmony of his neural architecture. He began with what I call the 4 dimensions of pattern harmony: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. In the physical dimension, he deconstructed his playing technique down to its smallest components. In the mental dimension, he reimagined what was possible for each of these components. In the emotional dimension, he connected deeply with the music he wanted to create. And in the spiritual dimension, he aligned his playing with his highest purpose as an artist. But here's what made his approach truly revolutionary. Instead of trying to force immediate change, he created what I call pattern bridges. Temporary neural pathways that allowed him to transition gradually from his current patterns to his desired patterns. When you're crossing a deep ravine, you don't try to jump across in one leap. You build a bridge. The same principle applies to rewiring your brain. Pattern bridges allow you to move from where you are to where you want to be while maintaining stability and functionality throughout the journey. The violinist created pattern bridges in every aspect of his playing. He developed intermediate fingering techniques that served as bridges between his old habits and his new aspirations. He created transitional mental patterns that helped him move from limiting beliefs to empowering ones. He built emotional bridges that carried him from acceptance of mediocrity to an insistence on excellence. Within 2 years, this violinist who had supposedly reached his ceiling was performing at a level that his former teachers had considered impossible. He hadn't just improved, he had fundamentally transformed the neural patterns that defined his capabilities. This brings us to a crucial understanding about greatness. It's not achieved through isolated changes or temporary surges of effort. Greatness emerges from the harmonious integration of elevated patterns across every dimension of your being. The patterns currently running your life, are they working in harmony to support your highest potential, or are they creating a symphony of limitation? Are your mental patterns aligned with your emotional patterns? Are your behavioral patterns in harmony with your aspirations? This is where the real work of brain rewiring begins. It's not enough to change individual patterns. You must ensure that all your new patterns work together to create what I call your Symphony of Excellence. Consider this. Every thought you think, every emotion you feel, every action you take is part of this symphony. When these elements are out of harmony, you experience internal conflict, self-sabotage, and unrealized potential. But when they align, when your thoughts, emotions, and actions work in perfect harmony, you experience what I call neural coherence. Neural coherence is the state where all your brain's patterns work together seamlessly to support your highest potential. It's the difference between a group of musicians playing independently and a symphony performing in perfect harmony. But achieving neural coherence requires more than just understanding. It requires a fundamental shift in how you view yourself and your potential. It requires what I call the 3 commitments of neural transformation. The first commitment is to conscious evolution. This means taking full responsibility for your brain's wiring. No more blaming circumstances, genetics, or past experiences. You must embrace the truth that you are the master programmer of your neural architecture. The second commitment is to pattern integrity. This means ensuring that each new pattern you create aligns with your highest values and aspirations. It's not enough to create powerful patterns. They must be patterns that serve your true purpose. The third commitment is to perpetual growth. This means understanding that brain rewiring isn't a destination. It's a continuous journey of evolution and refinement. Each new level of achievement becomes the foundation for the next level of growth. As we reach this moment of truth, I want you to understand something profound. The greatest battle you will ever fight isn't against external circumstances, it's against the limiting patterns in your own brain. But here's the empowering truth. You are equipped with everything you need to win this battle. Your brain's ability to rewire itself isn't just a scientific fact. It's your birthright as a human being. It's the key to unlocking potential you may have never imagined possible. Every person who has ever achieved greatness has done so by rewiring their brain's patterns, whether they consciously understood this process or not. But you have an advantage they didn't have. You now understand the principles, the processes, and the patterns that govern neural transformation. You have the blueprint for rewiring your brain for greatness. The question isn't whether you can change your brain's wiring. The question is whether you will use this power consciously and purposefully to create the life you truly desire. Right now, in this moment, your brain is rewiring itself based on the thoughts you're thinking and the emotions you're feeling. Every moment of every day, you're either strengthening patterns of limitation or creating patterns of liberation. The choice, and it is a choice, is yours. Will you continue to let your brain's patterns be shaped by circumstance and habit? Or will you take conscious control of your neural architecture and rewire it for the greatness that lies within you? Remember, the voice that told you, "This is just who I am," was wrong. That voice was simply a pattern, and patterns can be changed. The only ceiling on your potential is the one created by your brain's current wiring, and you now have the power to change that wiring. Your journey of neural transformation begins now, not tomorrow, not when circumstances are perfect, but right now, in this moment. Every new thought, every new action, every new choice is an opportunity to strengthen patterns of greatness. The question isn't, can I change? The question is, how great am I willing to become? Your brain is waiting for your answer. What will it be?